Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud or at knapsackcloud on Twitter. The crazy quarantine life carries on. I'm actually recording this from my business partner, Evan Lovely's house today because mine is under construction and there's no sound studios open yet. So today I want to welcome to the program Vidya Nayak. She's a design director for design systems at Social Finance, also called SoFi. Vidya, really great to have you. Thank you for agreeing to be on the program today.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me. And I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, so just jumping right into it, what originally struck us about wanting to have a conversation with you is that you're one of the people at a relatively major financial organization that actually has the words design systems in their title. And, this is happening more and more frequently, but this is still a pretty new thing. And so what attracted you to this role? How did you find this position? And what sort of steps did you take to get here?
So not many people know that my undergrad was in business. And, instead of crunching numbers, I found my way into design. And basically, I started off with traditional web and then obviously progressed into app design as the device industry took off. And I really enjoyed designing for users' experience. And, as they say, design is not just what it looks like or feels like, but it really is how well it works. So along the way, I realized that working with multi-platform teams was, a challenge. As I started leading teams and working on multi-product adoption, we were selling a lot of products as bundles. And I realized early in my career that, it was a challenge to really strike that consistency, right, across different products and different product suites that we were trying to sell. And, instead of reinventing the wheel or customizing things like a million times and providing really confusing experiences to the users, it got me thinking that, design system is something that, and at the time I had actually come across Lightning design system from Salesforce, and a lot of other companies were also trying to define their own design system. So obviously early in time, I felt like this is something that's really important.
Yeah, what did you see in Lightning that sort of was inspiring? That's a lot of people's first touch, right? And we actually interviewed Gina Ann, who was instrumental in the creation of Lightning. And I'm always curious what strikes people when they look at these things to say, I want to go do that. I want to work on things like that.
I'll tell you this. It was extremely challenging at the time to work with engineering partners and make sure that they're understanding why we think consistency is important. And it's not just, visual consistency, right? We're thinking about functional as well. And what I saw in Lightning design was the components were really easily defined, right? The documentation was so simple to understand. They catered to engineering as well as design teams. So to me, it felt like, this is really great. This is like a big box of Legos and, my team and I can go thoughtfully define the experience and help my other teams to really do their best work. Right. That's basically where it all started for me.
You hit on three of my favorite sayings, I guess, kind of all in the same statement, right? First of all, design being not just how it looks or how it feels, but how it works.
Right. And I'm quoting Steve Jobs. There.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. It's one of my favorites. And then enabling people to do their best work. I really believe in that as a tenet of leadership and management inside of organizations. Thinking about how other people that are listening to this show that are very invested in design systems as a part of their career, how would you, what advice would you give them for trying to find a leadership position inside of an organization, especially in a place like finance, that really is focused on these problems, these sets of components, this idea of playing with these Legos that let you build better experiences?
I think a couple of things that are important to keep in mind is, what is it that you really want to solve for? It's not just your team. You're going to be responsible for a number of problems. You're going to be responsible for empowering other teams as well. You're going to be responsible for content strategy. You're going to be responsible for, adoption, driving advocacy. right? Governance. There's so many things. So you really have to know that these are the things that you will be embracing and you will have to drive forward, sometimes single-handedly, across multiple teams and really strong stakeholders. So those are things that you should be ready about, and you should have some background experience working in that. I think it'll help make things really easy.
Gotcha. So thinking about, the broader picture, the bigger picture, if you will, you brought up content, and this is actually something that, is of particular interest to me. And that when you think about the stool that design systems sit on, right, there's the idea of design, there's the idea of development, there's the idea of product management. But one of the legs of this stool that we don't talk about that often is the content side of it, right? So when you think about a digital application experience, be that on the web or in a native app or something like that, content is innately tied to that experience. And so how do you think about content and content strategy specifically as it relates to your design system?
You're absolutely right. So if you do an audit across different libraries that are available today, you will see that only 35% of the libraries include voice and tone guidelines. So what about the rest, right? I think design system extends beyond just design, engineering, product, right? Even product marketing, we talk about it extensively, branding, but content writers really bring that voice and tone. It can be just a writing style or editorial style, or, how do you want to define your voice and tone for your brand? Is it conversational, right? And does it help reduce cognitive load in users? So I think there's plenty of aspects to it we don't really touch upon, and companies really need to focus on that some more.
So I completely agree with you. I think that when you look at how you construct an experience, right, there is a part of it that is this production of content that really takes the things that are less tangible and makes them more tangible. And the code and the components and the design is largely the container for those things, but it's the content itself that really makes it valuable to a user. And so when you think about incorporation of that inside of a design system, like from a practical sense, is that like, hey, I'm injecting a bunch of sample content into my components in my design system so I can take a look at it? Is it that I have like an API wired up that has this, content service that is attached to it? Like what are you doing to basically bring that voice to life inside of the design system?
So you hit the hammer on the nail. I was about to say that, there's so much thinking that needs to go into content as part of your components or patterns that you're defining, because do you use realistic copy, or do you just use placeholder and share it with your stakeholders, right, to get buy-in? I think there's a lot of things to be thought about, like, you cannot bypass it's user guides. You think about documentation, you think about release notes. So there's plenty of things that need to be factored in.
Yeah, there's only so much lorem ipsum that one person can take, I feel like.
Exactly.
And so when you think about like, how do I replace the lorem throughout the system? That's been kind of the like our take on this, right? Is you basically say like, where are the places that I have placeholder content that isn't actually real content, and how do I figure out ways of putting at least something that's a lot closer to my copy inside of that space.
Yeah.
And, it comes out all the time where it actually makes you have a better thought out design for your design system. The traditional problem of like, headlines, right? So having a card with a headline in it, now all of a sudden that headline wraps 2 lines. Like, well, what happens with the design? Like, especially if you have 3 cards side by side that are all supposed to be the same height.
Yeah. And do you present them with ellipses, or do you present them with some sort of read more, learn more sort of CTA? There's so many things to be figured out. And you're absolutely right. Like, within components, how do we present content? And whether it's an input field, right? Whether it's a button, how long should your labels be? Whether it's an onboarding copy, right? What is it that makes it easy for a user? So yeah, there's definitely a place for content strategy that where we all need to validate more.
I really like the thought of trying to make a lot of these decisions about content during design time instead of as afterthoughts that you then have to go back to the designer.
Yeah.
Or, maybe even in a better case, thinking about empowering those producers of that content to actually make some of those design decisions on their own.
Absolutely. And if you look at, even adding rules and guidelines that other teams can adopt and use, for example, how do your numbers, your amounts or digits, what's your format for dates, right? Simple things, but there's a lot of thought that goes into it, and that's what drives a lot of content consistency. Also, I look at content strategy as being as important as your design system component, library components and patterns, or visual language that you're applying, because you can see that content can look and like the voice and tone can be slightly different in every screen, and you'll start noticing that inconsistencies pretty starkly. And so, yeah, it's definitely important not to bypass.
So what about content personalization? When you think about the creation of personalized content to a specific audience or to a specific portion of an application versus the voice and tone of the whole app, does that take on a different strategy than for you guys, especially as it relates to your design system? Do you look at like your components in your design system as placeholders for what could be personalized, or do you think about it as a lot more evergreen?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good question, Chris. We think about personalization as a completely different aspect, because you cannot have one size fits all in every screen, every experience that you define. And I think if you look at any app today, a lot of the content is personalized. It's algorithmically driven, and which means that it's very, very catered to your patterns and your habits, right? So content should be formulated the same way, exactly the same way, I would say.
It's interesting to see where, as you start to slice pages into components and you start to get these things that were traditionally like big things, and you chop them down into littler and littler pieces, the process of making them smaller and smaller, you also are having to think about your personalization strategy in smaller and smaller chunks as well. Whereas we used to think about personalization at like a page level, we now have to think about it as a component level as well. And I think that that's this new thing that is sort of everybody's kind of grappling with, right? Like how deep do I go into the fragmentation of my page to personalize my user content?
Right. And as you defined it, like the smaller components, especially, it makes it more challenging, because you're now thinking about, if it's a card component, you'll think about the density of cards, right? You'll think about different surfaces, and how do you best provide that experience within that particular real estate that's confining.
Yeah, and when you talk about like how do you provide that best experience, right? I'm sure you look to that a lot. Being somebody, again, in a leadership role inside of an organization, how do you know that your design system is performing well? And I think that this is a little bit of a loaded question, because as the person sort of more or less responsible for the design system, trying to understand like how do you evaluate yourself. What are the types of metrics that you look for your team to hit? Like, what are their objectives? What are their benchmarks? And then what also do you then like roll up above you to basically say, like, this is how my team is performing and how we're driving success for SoFi?
Yeah, really good question. We've been defining design systems components based on our research, and we've been testing those, right? So it's really, really important not just to get qualitative data, but quantitative data as to how well are these components working. So that's the business aspect of it, right? Benchmarking with current experiences, making sure what's the delta. Look, you measure the delta after layering in your design system components or your newer updated experience that you're designing within the library, right? What spikes do you see? Is there a spike in the funnel? And so that sort of gives you the business aspect, which you can actually roll up to your exec leadership teams and say, hey, this is really effective. This is very useful and impactful. And, design system has, it's got its valuable presence. Then there are other aspects of accessibility. You think about app size. You think about, you care about app performance as well. You think about, from leadership standpoint, I think that, how often are components used? Are other teams using your components? How easy is it to use your component library? Is there a learning curve there? Or are people abandoning the component library and, doing their own thing? Or we have had teams in the past where, web teams especially have had their own UI toolkits, or native teams like iOS will do one thing and Android will do one thing. So when you want to measure the success of your design systems, you also want to, add instrumentation that will help you gather some usage data, right? So how useful your design system is, whether there's friction, and do your users abandon the screens? Where is the drop happening? So how many components do you see in your live environment? How easy is it to implement even for other engineering teams? And there's so many questions like that you measure towards. And if there are engineering teams who are not able to implement, what are their pain points? There's just a lot of things to consider in terms of workflows within teams as well. But those are all success metrics, like you measure against. You're not just driving efficiency for your own team, but also the company wide.
So do you track this on like a scorecard? Because that's a lot of stuff, right? Like there's all sorts of things there.
It is a lot of stuff.
So do you guys like have like a scorecard for your design system that basically says like we have this baseline, we have this scorecard that lines out our objectives, and then we have this end result that we hopefully get to?
We actually have OKRs that we measure against. And so every quarter, that's what we do. And our teams are very, very tightly aligned to those objectives. And so is our design system. So we want to make sure that not just my team, but the entire org is, driving towards the same mission.
Right. Supportive of strategy.
Yes. And that's what I think encourages people to contribute to design systems, because otherwise there's no incentive to build, no incentive to design, and no incentive to adopt. So I think company-wide OKRs should be common when it comes to really elevating and enhancing the app experience. Thinking
about how a design system supports strategy, when you're rolling up an OKR to an executive level inside of the organization, and then you're saying like, hey, because of these 25 other objectives that my team had related to performance, related to accessibility, related to adoption, what we drove was, a better NPS score, or a better funnel, or ultimately more business value is driven out of it. So do you guys think about the design system as a strategic asset inside of the business?
Absolutely, we do.
That's awesome.
Absolutely. This is so, and I'm glad you mentioned the NPS score, because that's super critical for any business.
So you're monitoring your work on the design system as something that is in support of strategy for the overall organization. And the things that the organization obviously cares about are therefore supported through your team and your set of OKRs, where essentially the design system is evolving to support the business. And that's a major strategic asset within the digital space for you guys.
I think it's important not just for my team or our team, the design system team, to define these objectives and to work towards these objectives, but it's also important for other teams to be, to row in the same direction, as we say, right? Because that really defines success overall, and then you will have better results as well for business, especially when you're supporting business at scale.
That's awesome. I think you're the first person I've talked to that really has linked the success of their design system to the success of a broader design strategy inside an organization. I think that's a really impressive feat, largely because oftentimes design systems are insurgencies. They're these small teams or these small groups within a single product, or maybe across a small product line that's a handful of products. And they're really fighting for this idea of strategic relevance at that higher level inside of the organization. And I think that building in a way to support that strategic goal early on, that seems to be a great way to roll up and elevate the value of the design system throughout the rest of the organization. Just kind of hold it up.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And the reason why we did this or took this direction is because, in the past, even in my previous jobs, I've actually, there's been failures, right? Like their design system was not adopted and not implemented, and there was no success at all for an entire year.
Sounds like a tech project.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, we're making, our roadmap looks great. We're going to make X amount of $1 million, but that doesn't mean that we need why do we need design systems, right? So those are the questions that sometimes you get from stakeholders too. And it's really important to make sure that you're defining objectives that are more global and not just restricted to your own team, because then it becomes just your responsibility. I think this is part of product efficiency. If you think about product excellence, right? Product efficiency, I think design systems should be a factor.
So thinking about the success that you've achieved with the design system to date and really holding it up as this pillar strategy for the design organization, where are you going from here? I'm really curious to hear, what is interesting in design systems for you, and what are you looking at next in terms of adding more value to this system that you've already shown a lot of success with?
I've come across design systems, successful design systems, such as Airbnb, right? And then we look at some of the things that we've defined in the past that have not really worked or have been very successful. But come to think of fast delivery for businesses at scale, especially like fast-moving companies, it's really important to know how design systems will flex to adapt these multiple devices and multiple surfaces that we're now struggling to design for, right? If it's a screen for your refrigerator, or if it's your tablet, or there's different sizes now to accommodate, right? So that's not an easy problem to solve, although it's not impossible. But I'm interested in learning more about how to achieve excellence in that. And, I've actually looked at Knapsack's design system, and I'm really blown away by the API driven, GitHub style design system where you can actually switch themes and you can actually easily implement design systems for multiple products and be able to customize as well, adding a layer of customization. So yeah, if there's a faster and easier way, an efficient way of doing it, I think that will be great, because the amount of time it takes to build components and to adapt and implement, I think that's where a lot of the velocity is lost. I would love to see more innovation there, more new ideas emerging there.
Thank you for the kind words. It's very flattering. And beyond that, we sort of see it the same way, where the idea of design systems at scale are largely predicated on the ability of how you can scale the number of apps you can support. And not every app is the same. Not everything runs on the same platform. Not everything has the same language. Not everything even has the same design or aesthetic or even brand at lots of companies.
Exactly. Yeah. And I talked about bundles, and I talked about products sold as within a product suite, right? And that's exactly what I was talking about, that, you might need some different themes for different products or different functionality that needs customization, further customization within your product suite. So how do you scale for that? And how does your design system flex there?
I think that it's oftentimes undervalued how complicated these things ultimately end up getting, right? When you think about multi-brand, multi-platform, multi-language, multi-team, that's a lot of fragmentation. And you can set up plenty of different pieces of software in isolation that go in and tackle one part of that fragmentation, right? Like I can go have something that manages my design files and have a really nice master design library. I can have another thing that like manages my component library and have a really nice set of component code. But you're sort of creating a different kind of fragmentation by doing that, because now you have all these different fragmented tools and they're not going to work for everybody across all these different parts of the system. And so it feels almost like, we're trying to solve this fragmentation problem by creating a new fragmentation problem sort of adjacent to the last one.
Yeah.
And so trying to think about like how we go about solving that. I mean, our take is APIs are the answer, right? We've long felt that is the direction that all of this needs to head. Is you need to think of a design system as a service, not just as its own static site.
Right.
But I think that there's lots of other really great ideas in this. And, how are you guys solving this problem? How are you thinking about like the multi-app, multi-platform approach to design systems?
To be honest, we're still figuring it out. Like I don't have an answer for you that this really works, let's go try it, or I highly recommend this. I think this is something that will take some trial and error and some permutation combination for us to come to a conclusion. But I think we're looking at React Native as being one of our options. And does that support multi-platform builds, right? We don't know yet. We have to see, right? We have to figure out what are the friction points for our engineering team. So there's a lot of questions and a lot of investigation to be done. But yeah, we're still looking for an answer.
Awesome. Well, I hope that we all arrive to that soon. I think,
yeah,
as we look at the future here, right, I think that we're sort of seeing the same thing, right? Like have these wonderful systems that are able to manage this thing in particular across platforms. So we don't have an Android app, a iPhone app, a refrigerator app, some other random IoT device app, and then a website that all have like essentially separate systems to manage them. And the common link right now is design tokens, but it could be so much more than that. And I think that that's like the really interesting sort of emergent problem in the space.
I agree.
This has been really awesome. So, hey, as a part of the podcast, we always like to have somebody sort of talk about the things that they're doing that are interesting in their personal life. And so, I know that we were talking before the show about the food you're making and what you're doing kind of in your COVID life, I guess. Tell us a little bit about what kind of motivates you and how that relates to design and kind of your everyday life.
I feel like in times of COVID, we're busier than ever. And I heard someone say that we are living at work. And honestly, I think, how do we optimize? When COVID hit, I think I was thinking about how do I work with less and maximize that? And that's with everything in life, right? Like things were not available. It was hard to go out. Coming back to my hobby and the love for cooking, I really enjoy making, just like design system, you have different components and elements and tokens, and you put that together and really come up with this amazing looking experience or provide, amazing looking screens. And so much like that, when I'm learning to cook, elaborate things, but with fewer ingredients. And so one of my favorite recipes is the biryani, and it's very famous not only in India but also the Middle East. And so I really enjoy making that. And it was a long impending thing on my list that I wanted to try because it's one of my mom's recipes, and I hadn't given it a shot. I was always very intimidated by how long it took and how many steps there were. So I definitely gave it a shot, and it turned out better than I expected. And
so the cooking thing, I totally understand that. I actually really love to cook myself. My dream is that someday I will have made enough money that I can own a restaurant and not have to think about making money at that restaurant. Because I love to cook. I love to cook for my friends. It's always really enjoyable to me. And I do also love the idea of taking something that is really complex, like a well-crafted, well-plated meal, and really thinking about it kind of from its like component elements, right? Like the idea of, hey, here's a recipe. Here's how you go about taking all of these like individually not that interesting things and making something really beautiful and interesting out of it.
Yep, absolutely. Much like you mentioned that taking that ingredient and thinking about the complex dish, right? I actually enjoy making dishes like that because it helps you. It also, gets you to experiment a little bit, give it your own sort of twist. And so that's something I really enjoy doing. So yeah, that's great.
No, I mean, it's your mom's recipe today, but it's your recipe tomorrow.
Yeah, well said.
It's one of the things I love about family cuisine, right? Is there's this idea also of kind of this tradition behind it, right? Mm-hmm. Like this like thought it evokes, or this emotion or this feeling that's behind the food. And I think one of the things that like to relate that back to design systems that's really interesting is the idea of the history of a company coming out in its design, right? Like I was talking to somebody from I believe it was a major insurance company. And they actually have a historian as a role inside of their design systems team, because there's this, 150-year-old story of this company and how it came to be and all of the history behind it that they basically decided was important enough that they wanted to codify it in their design system. And I thought that was a really interesting touch, much like, getting a recipe from your mom.
Yeah.
Of connecting yourself to the past is through design.
I'm actually pretty impressed that they have something like that, and I think the design system or the design of a company always tells a story, right? Because you see the evolution from what they were or where they started and where they've ended. And that's not the end, right? It's always there's much more evolution that'll come in the future, and the present becomes the past, right? So,
exactly.
There's always that cycle, but yeah.
So you're also an avid reader. You had been telling me about some of the books you've been reading. Has COVID just sparked this in you to dive back into books? Has this been something that's always kind of been a big part of your life? Tell me about that a little bit.
I wasn't an avid reader, but my brother is. And, my parents would always coax me growing up that you should read, because then that'll expand your knowledge and your perspective in life. And, that's true, right? And I picked that up much later in life, after college and after grad school. And now I really enjoy reading. I recently picked up And because we're in COVID and, we're always contemplating what the next thing would be in 2020 and how we're going to survive it. So I picked up this book called Ikigai, and it's basically, figuring out the purpose in life. It's a Japanese concept. There's this small town, Okinawa, in Japan, and basically how do you, how is that the population there lives until 100 years and beyond, and what's their secret about life and, increase life expectancy, and also how do you live life to the best, right? How do you be happy and find that purpose? And I think it's a much deeper book. I've just picked it up, so I'd love to share my learnings eventually.
I think that we could all learn a little bit, especially in our American culture and kind of the craziness of work-life balance right now, how to be more healthy and be more, I guess, mindful of the impact that work and stress and things like COVID have on our life. So yeah, I haven't read that personally, but I'm definitely interested in it, hearing you talking about it.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to share what I learned from that and, my takeaways. But I think, it's really important to think about how you want to live your life, especially given all the changing circumstances outside, right? How do you maintain that resilience? It's really hard, right?
Yeah.
Really hard to strike a balance, really hard to...
you're talking to a guy with a 2-month-old. It's super hard.
You never know. In a few years, maybe I would be saying this very differently. But at least for now, I'm reflecting, and thinking about what I have and being thankful for what I have, and not worry about what's changing outside constantly.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. This has been a great and just honestly full of joy and food and thoughtfulness conversation. So. And hopefully we learned a bit about design systems along the way. Thank you again for taking the time to chat with us. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure speaking with you and, chatting about food as well. My favorite topic. So pick my brain anytime for design systems or food. I would love to chat about it. And thank you very much for having me on this podcast.
That's all for today. We'd love to hear from you with questions, ideas for new episodes, beer recommendations, or comments. You can find us on Twitter @TheDSPod. Cheers, and thanks for listening to the Design Systems Podcast.